I'm originally from the prairies. Well, the label that I use these days is AIDS activist. I've lived in Toronto for over 30 years, but in 1993 I became medically disabled with AIDS. My near-death experiences, of which there were two, the doctors felt I had certainly no more than 2 years to live. I'm 54 years old. I didn't want to go to my grave a criminal. Jesus, what do they want? How many chemicals produced by pharmaceuticals am I supposed to take, and I can't have a simple herb, plant, that's got medicinal qualities? I live alone with my cat. I'm living with AIDS. I nearly died twice this year. I don't have a machinery to communicate with Canadians the way the government does, and it's very difficult to keep up the struggle.
Jim Wakeford's life has been a struggle, not just for himself, but for others. When Jim was young, he fought to keep kids off the streets and away from drugs.
I built a treatment center for kids and spent 20 years running it. It's called Ulagan Community Services, and I was the founder and executive director. And then I went on to found the Casey House Hospice Foundation, the fundraising arm of Casey House. But in 1993, I became medically disabled with AIDS.
Having experienced adverse side effects to his AIDS medications, Jim eventually turned to marijuana for relief of his pain. In 1996, Jim began what is commonly known as wasting.
I was down to 118 pounds before I went into the hospital, and I've been out for 4 months and smoking daily before meals, usually just before dinner, and I've gained 20 pounds.
At his clinic in East Toronto, Dr. John Goodhue, Jim's physician, is accustomed to having his patients use marijuana to alleviate the side effects of the AIDS medication.
As time went on and as more treatments became available for HIV, consequently Jim was taking more and more drugs. Issues like nausea and loss of appetite became more of an issue, and consequently the marijuana began to be something that we addressed more in the office.
I was taking 50 to 60 pills a day and having really horrendous side effects.
He was taking Crixivan, which is a protease inhibitor. He was taking DDI, which is a AZT-like drug, and he was taking 3-TC, which is an AZT-like drug. That was the core of his anti-HIV therapy. On paper, the drugs were doing great things. It was just, in real life, they were killing him.
And so, if marijuana is indeed Jim Wakeford's most viable option, then why is he still prohibited from using it?
It has such a stigma in our culture. Most people call it pot, or they make jokes about it. This plant, this simple medicine, is useful to counter the reefer madness mania that has run through North America now for 30 years.
Activism has played a major role in Jim's life ever since the 60s.
We were going to change the world. It was a whole different culture. I'm so glad I lived and was part of that, and I still am a hippie. I believe that we can change the world, although that's tempered now. At the age of 54, I realize how slow change takes in a culture.
Today, Jim is still fighting for positive change, having been the first Canadian to launch a civil suit against the government to fight for the medicinal legalization of marijuana.
I have no criminal record. I've never been busted for any offense of any kind. All the other cases before the courts are in the criminal courts, and there are people fighting for their rights in that venue. Mine is a different case. It's a civil case.
Jim's lawyer, Osgood Hall professor Alan Young, felt that by filing a civil suit, they would significantly lower Jim's chances of having charges raised against him in a criminal court.
He was never charged with anything because he acts very discreetly and actually was very sick, so I mean he wouldn't attract much attention. And I thought long and hard about it and thought that he was almost like the poster child for the issue. So we decided that we would initiate legal action by suing the government for relief as opposed to waiting for them to come and raid him and arrest him for having an ounce of marijuana.
Jim faces the risk of being arrested each and every day. Rick Chase, a detective with the Toronto Police Force for the Central Field Command Drug Squad, is one of the many people that Jim must do his best to avoid.
Well, it's starting to come up quite a bit more now that it's been in the public view through the media. Every time in the last couple of months where we've arrested somebody on marijuana, they're saying, well, we're taking it for medicinal purposes. Again, that goes back to stricter controls that the doctors will have to have on their patients.
I'm not prescribing marijuana. I'm not advocating it in these individual cases. I'm not telling them to go out and do it. So from a regulatory point of view, say the College of Physicians and Surgeons that disciplines doctors, I haven't crossed any lines.
Although Dr. Goodhue hasn't broken any laws, Jim is lighting up joint after joint in his effort to keep himself alive. Jim claims his battle is one of necessity, but the courts didn't see it that way.
I'm not supposed to have any pleasure, of course. That was something that that court case was excruciating. They did everything they possibly could, the Crown attorneys, to discredit me and to discredit my doctor.
I would say they tried to attack maybe his doctor a bit more than him, because it's pretty hard to attack a dying man. And they sort of tried to create an impression of his doctor as being an irresponsible physician who really didn't try to put Jim through the paces of increasing doses of synthetic products and just said, oh yeah, go ahead, you know, in a cavalier way, just use marijuana.
And the basic approach of their argument was, they went through that blue book on my desk, which is the list of all the drugs available in Canada. And they listed every single anti-nausea agent that's available. And they just asked me, did you prescribe this one? Did you prescribe this one? And there's lots I didn't prescribe, but there's roughly 5 classes of anti-nausea agents, and Jim tried drugs from every class, and they simply didn't work, or they had side effects that were intolerable. Now, if a drug like Stemetil, which is a dopamine blocker, if that causes Jim to feel like a zombie, am I going to have to try the other 23 drugs in that class and make him feel like a zombie with 23 other drugs before concluding that he can't take these drugs? I don't really think that's a humane way to treat medicine.
Jim tried many different appetite stimulants, including Marinol, a synthetic marijuana derivative widely used by AIDS patients. But for Jim, the side effects were greater than the benefits.
I tried Marinol once, and it caused such severe nausea and discomfort that went on for 7 or 8 hours that I've refused to take it again. But I tried on my own at that time smoking marijuana to deal with the side effects of the nausea, and found it also, of course, stimulated my appetite. I'd forgotten about what's called the munchies.
But it's ridiculous. They've synthesized the psychoactive ingredient, and who knows what's giving it its therapeutic value. This is a very complex plant with over 400 compounds, chemical compounds, and 60 different cannabinoids, and suddenly we take the psychoactive one, because we were fortunate enough to isolate it in the 1970s, synthesize it and give it to medical patients, and most of them don't like it, for the simple reason it doesn't have the full therapeutic value, because it doesn't have the interplay of all the chemicals, and people are getting really high that don't want to be high.
At times I felt like I was being chided like a little kid who didn't take his cod liver oil. He didn't take his Marinol enough, didn't try it enough. Jesus, what do they want?
The answer is simple. The police and the courts are skeptical in regards to the positive uses of marijuana. Convinced that there are other alternatives, little sympathy is granted to those who claim medicinal use.
There are other drugs that can be taken to combat the symptoms, same symptoms. Sometimes I think it's a bit of a cop-out by the people that are using it, that they want that marijuana high and they want it for free. And whether or not it actually helps them, there's not a lot of medical evidence to that effect.
I basically think that marijuana should be available to people who need it for legitimate medical reasons. That's the position that I'm willing to take as a doctor and that I have taken.
One of the reasons that I decided to turn to the courts was because of seeing my brothers and sisters being harassed, brutalized, victimized, fined, jailed for using medicine.
In February of 1997, Jim and his lawyer decided to take the matter to the courts.
Well, we had 2 days in court where we argued the application. I thought we would be successful for a number of reasons. One, our argument's very compelling. We were very thorough in our preparation. I thought all of us were really cogent in our presentation. The Crown did not have anything constructive to say, as I mentioned a moment ago. They looked petty and callous in trying to suggest that Jim's okay, he doesn't really need this. And the judge seemed responsive. But what happened was the judge, with no disrespect intended, because this is the nature of the institution, took the easy way out, really the cowardly way out, by passing the issue back to Parliament.
The Prime Minister referred me to the Justice Minister. The Justice Minister never responded to my letter, although publicly she called for debate. And the Minister of Health wrote back saying I could have heroin or cocaine if I met certain criteria, as any Canadian can, for medical conditions. But I couldn't have cannabis because it was a banned substance, and he wished me well.
We'll have the most dramatic change in the law when the government realizes they can make money or just save money. Because we do spend about $1 billion a year chasing cannabis criminals, and maybe they'll decide they don't want to waste that money anymore. But it will be decided on economic considerations and not on basic principles of ethics, morality, or political wisdom.
I think increasingly people are just getting tired of it. People who have nothing to do with this issue, people who are on the forefront of policing it. I think police are sick to death of pot. I think judges are sick to death of pot, especially when it's being used to help somebody who's sick.
And I would urge people, more people, to have the guts to stand up and say something publicly and do something.
In his efforts to reach out to the public, Jim attends an alternative drug fair at a local church, but the fair's attendance is low, and the words of the speaker echo in the church's empty halls. For Jim, the quest to get the word out will be long and tedious, but he is determined to be heard, even if it means reaching out to one person at a time.
I personally don't have any sympathy for it. I don't have enough resources to monitor these people on an ongoing basis to make sure that they're following the letter of the law, and I just don't have the time for that.
I don't really like lawyers. I don't like the legal profession. And this is my own little contribution to subversion and anarchy, and that's why I do it.
The latest public opinion surveys that I have heard have shown overwhelming support for the medical use of marijuana. I don't think any government would really take big hits in the poll if they were to decriminalize it or make it available, as Jim wants, for medical use.
I resent having to go to the black market to buy it. I resent having to live every day with the knowledge that the cops could come in and bust me and make my life very unpleasant and confiscate my medicine and disrupt my life and cause me incredible stress. So until these laws are changed, people like me will continue to fight them.
Waking to these sounds again, I wonder how I'll sleep. Passing out is Work out all these cycles and why I'm standing here.